The year was 53 BCE, and Rome's hunger for conquest had reached fever pitch. Three men ruled the known world through an uneasy alliance: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his partners carved their legends through military genius, Crassus faced a humiliating truth. He was seen as nothing more than a banker among warriors. His vast wealth, accumulated through real estate speculation and slave labor, bought him political influence, but not the respect he desperately craved. Crassus had watched Caesar conquer Gaul and Pompey dominate the Mediterranean, their victories echoing through Rome's marble halls, while his own achievements were measured only in sestertii. The sting of being called the third wheel of the triumvirate gnawed at him constantly. At 60 years old, most men would have been content to enjoy their riches, but Crassus saw only one path to true glory: military conquest that would rival his more famous allies. The Parthian Empire beckoned like a golden prize beyond Rome's eastern frontier. Stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, this vast kingdom controlled the lucrative silk and spice routes that connected east and west. Crassus convinced himself that conquering Parthia would not only bring military glory, but also unimaginable wealth, enough gold and silver to make even his fortune seem modest. The Senate, suspicious of his ambitions, refused to grant him the traditional declaration of war, but Crassus pressed forward regardless. In 55 BCE, Crassus arrived in Syria as governor, immediately beginning preparations for his grand invasion. He ignored the warnings of local commanders who understood Parthian military tactics, dismissing their concerns as cowardice. The desert kingdoms had always fallen to Roman discipline and engineering. Why should Parthia be different? His confidence was bolstered by intelligence reports suggesting internal strife within the Parthian court, making them appear vulnerable to a decisive Roman strike. Crassus assembled a massive force, 7 legions totaling nearly 40,000 men, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light infantry. The army represented one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever assembled for Eastern conquest. Among his officers was his beloved son Publius, a proven warrior who had served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul. The presence of his heir gave Crassus additional motivation. This campaign would establish a dynasty of military glory. The invasion began in spring of 53 BCE, with Roman forces crossing the Euphrates at Zeugma. Initial progress seemed to validate Crassus's confidence. Local settlements either surrendered without resistance or fell quickly to Roman siegecraft. The flat Mesopotamian terrain appeared ideal for Roman heavy infantry tactics, and early intelligence suggested that King Orodes II of Parthia was distracted by internal rebellions, leaving the frontier lightly defended. However, Crassus's early success was actually part of a carefully orchestrated Parthian strategy. General Surena, the young commander of Parthian forces, was deliberately drawing the Romans deeper into the desert, away from their supply lines and into terrain that favored Parthian cavalry over Roman infantry. The few skirmishes that occurred were tactical retreats designed to give Crassus false confidence, while exhausting his army through forced marches in brutal heat. As the Roman army pushed deeper into Mesopotamian desert, the true nature of their enemy began to reveal itself. The Parthians were not the disorganized barbarians that Roman propaganda portrayed, but a sophisticated military power with centuries of experience fighting in their homeland's harsh conditions. Their army was built around mobility and ranged combat: heavy cavalry known as cataphracts for shock attacks, and lighter horse archers who could strike from impossible distances while remaining beyond Roman reach. Surena's strategy exploited every weakness in Roman military doctrine. Where Romans relied on close formation fighting and engineering, Parthians emphasized speed and flexibility. Where Romans expected set-piece battles with clear objectives, Parthians preferred harassment and attrition. Most critically, where Romans assumed their enemies would eventually engage in decisive combat, Parthians were content to avoid direct confrontation while slowly bleeding their opponents dry through constant skirmishing. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Parthian scouts would appear on distant ridges, just visible enough to keep Roman soldiers constantly on edge, then vanish before any pursuit could be organized. Supply convoys came under attack from invisible enemies who struck without warning and disappeared into the vastness of the desert. Sleep became a luxury as sentries reported strange sounds and movements throughout the night, leaving the entire army exhausted and paranoid. Crassus began to realize that traditional Roman tactics were proving inadequate against this new type of warfare. His heavy infantry, invincible in European forests or Mediterranean coastal plains, struggled with the heat, terrain, and unconventional enemy tactics. The cavalry forces he had assembled were insufficient for the mobile warfare that dominated the region, and his supply lines were becoming increasingly vulnerable to Parthian raids that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The critical moment came at Carrhae, a small city in northern Mesopotamia where Crassus decided to make his stand. Local geography seemed to favor his position. Hills provided defensive positions for his infantry, while the presence of a water source would solve his supply problems. Intelligence reports suggested that Surena's main force was approaching, offering the decisive battle that Crassus believed would vindicate his entire campaign and demonstrate Roman superiority once and for all. The Battle of Carrhae began at dawn on June 9th, 53 BCE, with Roman forces arranged in their traditional formation, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, and light troops screening the main force. Crassus positioned himself with the center, while his son Publius commanded the right-wing cavalry. The formation looked impressive in the morning light, standards gleaming and armor polished, representing the finest military machine the ancient world had ever seen. Surena's approach revealed the true brilliance of Parthian military science. Instead of a traditional army formation, the Romans faced something they had never encountered: a purely cavalry force that moved like a single organism across the desert floor. The Parthian heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe in gleaming metal scales, formed the center, while thousands of horse archers flowed around them like water, creating a constantly shifting tactical situation that Roman commanders couldn't predict or counter. The battle opened with a massive Parthian arrow barrage that darkened the sky above the Roman formation. Unlike previous enemies who would exhaust their ammunition quickly, the Parthians had organized supply trains of fresh arrows that kept their archers constantly supplied. Roman shields, designed to stop spears and swords, proved inadequate against the sustained missile bombardment that continued hour after hour without respite, gradually wearing down Roman morale and effectiveness. Publius Crassus, young and eager to prove himself, made the fatal decision to break formation and charge the Parthian center with his cavalry wing. This played directly into Surena's strategy. The heavy cataphracts absorbed the Roman charge, while horse archers surrounded the exposed cavalry force. Cut off from the main army and surrounded by enemies who struck from all sides, Publius's force was systematically destroyed in full view of his horrified father and the remainder of the Roman army. The death of Publius marked the psychological turning point of the battle. Surena's men severed the young man's head and mounted it on a spear, parading it before the Roman battle line while his father watched in stunned horror. The sight of his son's head bobbing above enemy ranks shattered whatever composure Crassus had maintained throughout the campaign. The confident general who had crossed the Euphrates months earlier was replaced by a broken old man who could barely give coherent orders. Roman discipline began to collapse as the reality of their situation became clear. They were trapped in hostile territory, surrounded by an enemy who could strike at will while remaining beyond retaliation. Water supplies were running low. The dead and wounded were accumulating faster than they could be treated, and every attempt to break out resulted in heavier casualties. The desert that had seemed like an open highway to conquest had become a prison with no visible escape. As night fell, Crassus attempted to organize a retreat toward the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping that urban terrain would neutralize Parthian cavalry advantages. However, The withdrawal turned into a rout as exhausted Roman soldiers abandoned their equipment and discipline in a desperate attempt to reach safety. Thousands were cut down during the chaotic night march, while others simply collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke, left behind by comrades who could barely save themselves. The remnants of Rome's great Eastern army stumbled into Carrhae as dawn broke, having lost nearly half their strength in a single day of combat. The proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates were reduced to a desperate mob of survivors, their standards lost, their confidence shattered, and their commander broken by grief and the magnitude of his failure. Crassus had achieved the decisive battle he wanted, but the decision had gone entirely against him. Zurina, rather than pressing his advantage with an immediate assault on the city, chose to demonstrate Parthian magnanimity by offering negotiations. He sent envoys under flags of truce, proposing a meeting between commanders to discuss terms for Roman withdrawal. The offer seemed reasonable. Both sides had suffered casualties, and the Parthians had proven their point about Roman vulnerability. For Crassus, desperate to salvage something from the disaster, the proposal offered hope of saving at least some of his men. The meeting was arranged to take place in the neutral ground between the two armies, with both commanders accompanied by small retinues of officers. Crassus, despite warnings from subordinates who suspected treachery, agreed to the parley. His desperation to end the nightmare overcame his tactical judgment. He needed to believe that some honorable solution was possible, that his great gamble hadn't resulted in complete catastrophe for Rome and personal ruin for himself. What happened next remains disputed among ancient historians, but the outcome was clear enough. The meeting erupted into violence, with Parthian soldiers overpowering the Roman delegation. Whether this was premeditated treachery or the result of misunderstandings and mutual suspicions, Crassus found himself a prisoner of the man who had destroyed his army and killed his son. The richest man in Rome was now entirely at the mercy of enemies who had every reason to hate what he represented. Surina's treatment of his captive revealed the depth of Parthian anger toward Roman ambitions. This was not merely a defeated general to be ransomed or executed quickly. Crassus represented everything the Parthians despised about Roman expansion. His invasion had been unprovoked, aggression motivated purely by greed and ambition, launched without regard for Parthian sovereignty or the lives that would be lost in pursuit of his personal glory. The decision to execute Crassus in a manner befitting his character and crimes reflected both Parthian justice and their understanding of symbolic messaging. In a culture that valued honor and measured character by actions rather than wealth, Crassus embodied everything contemptible about Roman values. His death needed to send a message not just to Rome, but to any future invaders who might mistake Parthian territories for easy conquests. The method chosen was both practical and deeply symbolic. Molten gold, the metal that had defined Crassus's life and motivated his disastrous invasion, would become the instrument of his death. Parthian craftsmen heated gold until it reached liquid form, creating a substance that would burn through human tissue while carrying profound symbolic meaning. The man who had worshipped gold above all else would experience its true nature: beautiful but deadly, precious but ultimately destructive. The execution took place before an audience of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, making it both a judicial proceeding and a public demonstration. Crassus was forced to his knees while Parthian soldiers held his mouth open, preventing any last words or pleas for mercy. The molten gold was poured slowly, ensuring maximum suffering while creating a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed for generations throughout the ancient world. The physical agony was unimaginable. Liquid gold at temperatures exceeding 1900 degrees Fahrenheit, burning through mouth, throat, and internal organs while Crassus remained conscious. But the symbolic message was equally important. The man who had valued gold above human life, who had built his fortune through exploitation and violence, was experiencing gold's true nature as a destructive force. His worship of wealth had literally become his damnation. Witnesses described Crassus's final moments as a grotesque parody of his life's ambitions. The mouth that had spoken of conquest and glory was filled with the metal he had pursued across continents. The throat that had delivered speeches about Roman destiny was burned beyond recognition. The body that had enjoyed luxury beyond imagination was transformed into a warning about the consequences of unchecked greed and ambition. The aftermath of Crassus's death sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world that extended far beyond the immediate military disaster. News of the execution reached Rome within weeks, creating panic among the ruling class, who suddenly realized that their eastern frontier was not secure, and that their enemies possessed both the capability and willingness to inflict humiliating defeats on Roman arms. The myth of Roman invincibility, carefully cultivated through centuries of expansion, had been shattered in the Mesopotamian desert. The political consequences within Rome were immediate and severe. The triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for years was broken, leaving Pompey and Caesar as rivals rather than partners. Without Crassus's wealth and influence to balance their competing ambitions, the two remaining strongmen began the political maneuvering that would eventually lead to civil war and the end of the Roman Republic. In death, Crassus had inadvertently triggered the very conflicts he had sought to avoid through Eastern conquest. Parthian treatment of other Roman prisoners demonstrated that Crassus's execution was not merely sadistic cruelty, but part of a calculated strategy to deter future Roman aggression. Many surviving soldiers were settled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they established communities and gradually assimilated into local populations. These former Romans served as living examples of Parthian mercy toward those who had not chosen war, contrasting sharply with the fate of their commander who had initiated the conflict. The symbolic resonance of Crassus's death extended throughout the ancient world, inspiring artists, writers, and philosophers for generations. The image of molten gold being poured into the mouth of Rome's richest man became a powerful metaphor for the dangers of excessive materialism and unchecked ambition. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, used the execution as a moral lesson about the corrupting influence of wealth and the inevitable consequences of hubris. Modern historians continue to debate the exact details of Crassus's death, with some questioning whether the molten gold story is literal truth or symbolic representation. However, the broader historical significance remains clear. The execution marked a turning point in Roman expansion eastward and demonstrated that the empire's enemies were capable of sophisticated psychological warfare that went beyond mere military tactics. The manner of death, whether precisely accurate or not, captured essential truths about the conflict's meaning. The location of Crassus's remains became part of Parthian propaganda efforts, with his head allegedly sent to the court of King Orodes II, where it was used as a prop in theatrical performances mocking Roman pretensions. Some accounts suggest that Parthian actors used the severed head during performances of Euripides' Bacchae, with Crassus representing the tragic figure whose excessive ambitions led to destruction. These theatrical presentations turned Roman defeat into ongoing entertainment for Parthian audiences. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield at Carrhae continues to yield insights into the scope of the Roman disaster, with weapons, armor fragments, and skeletal remains painting a picture of complete military catastrophe. The artifacts tell the story of a professional army that was systematically destroyed by enemies who understood both the tactical situation and the psychological dimensions of warfare. Roman military manuals were revised based on lessons learned from the defeat, but the damage to imperial prestige could never be fully repaired. The legacy of Crassus's death influenced Roman foreign policy for decades, making subsequent emperors more cautious about Eastern adventures and more respectful of Parthian military capabilities. The disaster demonstrated that Rome's enemies were not simply barbarian tribes to be conquered through superior discipline and engineering, but sophisticated civilizations with their own military traditions and strategic thinking. This recognition marked the beginning of a more mature phase in Roman expansion that emphasized diplomacy alongside military force. The story of Marcus Crassus serves as a timeless warning about the dangers of allowing personal ambition to override wisdom and restraint. His transformation from successful businessman to military disaster illustrates how individual character flaws can have consequences far beyond personal failure, affecting entire civilizations and altering the course of history. The molten gold that killed him remains a powerful symbol of how the things we desire most intensely can become the instruments of our destruction. In our modern world, where wealth inequality and political ambition continue to shape global events, the death of Crassus offers sobering lessons about the relationship between power and responsibility. His story reminds us that true leadership requires more than accumulating resources or achieving tactical victories. It demands wisdom, empathy, and understanding of the broader consequences of our actions. The golden throat that silenced Rome's richest man continues to whisper warnings across the centuries about the price of unchecked greed and the importance of knowing when enough is truly enough.